Today, Marine aviators fly some of the most modern and technologically advanced aircraft in the sky. Yet in their earlier years, they were often thought of as wild-eyed renegades, tough-talking bulldozers of men who made the most out of the most modest resources. Today, they stand as a proud force of men and women. That pride has been drawn from their own history, a history that contains both the glory of past achievement and the promise of a brilliant future.
First to fight is the motto of a small and specialized group of fighting men who, for over 200 years, have been the first to be called whenever American interests have been threatened abroad. Their total manpower is only a fraction of the other services, yet they have proven time and again they are the equal of any other force on Earth. Their pride, their courage, their esprit de corps are legendary. Send in the Marines has become a national rallying cry. They have fought successfully on land, on sea, and in the air, all around the world. Marine Corps aviation plays a different role than that of the Air Force. Their mission is more tactical and strategic. Of course, their job can encompass many of the tasks the Air Force may take on. Marine Corps aces rank with the very best in American history. But their special assignment has been the direct support of Marine troops on the ground. It's their specialization in this task which has made Marine Air famous throughout the world. Pilots who can provide close air support, precision work that requires fast, accurate, low-level delivery of bombs and other ordnance on the enemy, often within yards of friendly troops. This is what Marine Air is about. It was the pilots themselves who created that purpose by demonstrating in combat to their skeptical superiors what could be accomplished. And they did it with old, outdated aircraft, minimal funding, and very little encouragement from above. They first proved themselves long ago in a forgotten battle in an obscure war, which today is only a footnote to American history. It was in Nicaragua in 1927.
The era was called the Roaring Twenties, and roar they did. Patriotism ran high, as did America's economic and political might. American corporations like the United Fruit Company made big investments in small foreign countries. Many engaged in the celebration of what appeared to be the promise of unlimited prosperity. There was peace at home, but not always abroad. United States Marines were sent to countries like Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In 1927, additional forces landed in Nicaragua. They said they were there to fight bandits, to protect the local population, as well as the corporate interests that America had exported to their shores. With them, they brought airplanes. Through the air shows and races that became popular attractions in the 1920s, Marine air squadrons had fought a public relations battle for their existence. Following World War I, 4 squadrons were funded by Congress, a total of little more than 1,000 men, officers, pilots, and ground crew included. Marines, along with all other services, found themselves engaged in a continuing effort to win public approval and funding. Sometimes this involved activities that looked more like headline-hunting stunts than serious military exercises. The small contingent of Marines sent to Nicaragua became engaged in a series of battles with the forces of Augusto Sandino, a populist leader who hoped to establish a more accessible democracy. On July 16, 1927, word came that a detachment of U.S. Marines and Nicaraguan National Guard had engaged a superior force of Sandino's men in a remote mountain village. Without improved roads leading into the area, it would take 10 days to reinforce them by land. Unaided, they would surely be wiped out. A Marine major named Cunningham conceived a desperate rescue mission. He added bombs to the machine guns already in place on his 4 World War I vintage Jennies and set off on a rescue flight. It took a little over an hour to reach the scene of the battle. Once there, he gained radio contact with the Marines on the ground and led his flight in a crude but effective dive bombing raid on a surprised enemy. As a result, Marine troops were able to upset the enemy's plans, scatter and demoralize them, and carry the day. Marine air had previously been limited to the role of observation and reconnaissance. Now, the troops on the ground had the promise of a new resource at their disposal. In the coming decade, as Marines returned from their foreign assignments for training with new equipment and tactics, that resource would not be forgotten. Nearly 15 years later, the value of Marine air was put to its first extensive test. It took place on the strangest of battlegrounds, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. And it began on a December morning, the same morning that Pearl Harbor became a household word. It began on a tiny atoll, 2,000 miles west of Hawaii, a place called Wake Island. On this tiny outpost were 1,200 civilians engaged in construction work, 388 men of the 1st Marine Defense Brigade, a Pan American Airways China Clipper base, some modest defensive armament, and the 62 men and 12 fighter planes belonging to Marine Fighter Squadron, VMF-211. Brand new Grumman F-4, F-3 Wildcats had been assigned to VMF-211 only months before. The planes had landed on Wake 4 days earlier, finding a narrow, incomplete landing strip without adequate revetments or service facilities. Now, only hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, 36 Japanese bombers flew in V-shaped formations toward the tiny outpost, a lone speck amidst the white-capped waves of the Pacific Ocean. Reaching Wake near noon, the bombers caught the island defenders by complete surprise. They headed straight for the airfield, bombing and strafing 8 Wildcats that were lined up in clear view along the runway. Next, they turned their attention to the Pan Am facilities. When it was over, Wake had lost 23 members of VMF-211 and 65 civilians. Only 4 fighter planes remained, and much of the available fuel and ammunition was destroyed. A new command post was established in a reinforced magazine near the airfield, and crews set about repairing damaged aircraft with salvaged parts and making all possible preparations for the inevitable invasion to come. 3 days later, it happened. A force of 11 ships and 2 patrol boats approached Wake Island under cover of darkness and prepared to make their landing. The islanders watched and waited, playing silent until the Japanese were close to shore. Then suddenly, Marine guns sprang into action, and 4 Marine F-4Fs rose from the island runway to do battle. Flying in formation, they were at first held back by clouds that blocked their view. But finally, they dove in pairs, strafing and dropping bombs from jury-rigged bomb racks. The results were impressive. A Japanese cruiser was hit. Several other ships were sunk or damaged, and the Japanese rear admiral in charge of the operation decided to turn back without attempting a landing. By the end of the day, Wake Island's defenders had exacted a heavy toll. The landing force limped away heavily damaged, having lost hundreds of men and leaving 2 ships and a patrol boat to lie under the cool waters of the Pacific. The Wildcats of VMF 211 had proven essential, but they knew the Japanese would return. Their only hope of relief lay in the quick dispatch of reinforcements from Pearl Harbor. But with 2,000 miles of open ocean between Hawaii and Wake Island, there was little hope they could arrive either safely or in time. Japanese planes returned to bomb the Americans almost every day. On December 21st, the bombers came for the first time with fighter escorts. The following day, the last 2 Wildcats were lost in combat. The remaining members of VMF 211 reorganized to man the island's defensive guns. Around them lay the torn and shattered remains of buildings and airplanes, utterly destroyed after 2 weeks of almost daily bombardment. The end was in sight by December 23rd. In the early hours of pre-dawn, 27 Japanese ships returned with a much larger landing force, and this time with the support of 2 aircraft carriers. The battle was swift and conclusive. In the face of such enormous odds, the Marines were forced to surrender. The price of victory had been stiff for the Japanese. To defeat a few hundred Marines and a dozen aircraft, the Japanese had accepted the loss of 3 ships, 21 planes, and 820 fighting men. But they had won, and in so doing, they had disturbed a sleeping giant. America was called to action.
Marine Corps aviators, hopelessly outnumbered, had fought heroically in defense of Wake Island, but in the early days of Japanese conquest, it was inevitably a delaying action with no real chance of victory. The entire American arsenal was woefully short of the equipment and manpower needed to stave off defeat. Outdated biplanes, obsolete fighters, even training aircraft were used to hold the line in the early months of the war, while a newly awakened and enraged America geared up to produce new planes and the aviators to fly them. But the big question in every mind was, where will Japan strike next?
The scene was another coral atoll, another tiny outpost in the middle of the Pacific. And once again, United States Marines were the defenders. After 6 months of war, the Japanese appeared to be winning at every turn. Now the Japanese High Command planned to deal a second crushing blow to the American Navy. At Midway Island, they would lure what remained of the United States Pacific Fleet into a trap. Midway was a flat, nearly barren piece of real estate, valuable only as an airbase, an unsinkable aircraft carrier amidst thousands of miles of shimmering salt water. Here, Marine Air Group 22 was stationed. Here, Army Air Corps B-17 bombers were refueled for the long trip across the Pacific to Australia. The Marine arsenal included a ragtag assortment of planes. More modern types were supplemented by obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Vultee trainers. But what the Japanese didn't realize was that American admirals had in their possession Japan's own secret codes, and that permitted them to decipher much of the Japanese plans in advance. This allowed them to plan a counter-trap. Still, the Japanese force possessed a superiority in numbers which the Americans could not hope to match. Only with aircraft did they stand a chance. Both sides would bring aircraft carriers to the battle, but in order to succeed, the Japanese plan required that they strike first and eliminate all island-based aircraft in that first blow. Only then would they be free to concentrate on the naval battle and crush the Americans. On the morning of June 4th, The planes from the main Japanese force took off to strike Midway Island. The battle was on. But it would not be a surprise. Before enemy planes reached the island, most of the Marine and Army aircraft they were supposed to destroy on the ground had already taken off. Some stayed nearby to meet the incoming Japanese, but most headed out to sea to attack Japanese carriers. That left the defenders on the ground as the principal force to repel a furious wave of attacking Japanese airplanes. This they had to do to save their airstrip, their fuel and ammunition supplies from the destruction that was rained on them from above. Following the first wave of Army and Marine planes would be carrier-based Navy aircraft. It was the Navy flyers who would emerge the popular heroes of the day. Many of the Marine pilots were flying the new SBD Dauntless, a powerful dive bomber in which these fresh pilots had received little if any training. As they began their attack, many were entering combat for the first time. It was a school that permitted no mistakes. The Japanese had fighters and powerful anti-aircraft guns. In the next several hours, the course of the war might very well be determined. The battle raged back and forth between land and carrier battle groups for 2 days. Japanese planes found American carriers as the two sides traded punches. In the end, it was the Japanese who withdrew, and the Americans returned to their land bases and ships with the knowledge that for the first time, they had stopped the empire of the rising sun in its tracks. It had been an expensive battle for both sides, and the Marine aviators who made up much of the first wave had suffered severely. Patrol planes scoured the trackless ocean for downed flyers who spent days, sometimes weeks, alone in life rafts or clinging to floating wreckage. They had needed more training and better aircraft, but they had gone against the enemy anyway. And now they might get a chance to do what Marines had always done best, to go on the offensive, to attack rather than to defend. The Battle of Midway signaled the turning point that everyone had been waiting for. Now was the time to move ahead. It was 2 months after the Battle of Midway. Many troops and tons of supplies had been moved by ship to a point far to the south, in the Coral Sea near the Solomon Islands. This was the greatly anticipated first step back. And the most important prize was the island of Guadalcanal. It was here that the Japanese were building an important airfield. We could use it, if we could capture it. August 7th. The landing proceeded quickly, efficiently, and with ominous quiet. The stiff resistance that the Marines expected did not materialize. Instead, they established a mile-deep beachhead and began to unload all kinds of supplies: food, ammunition, and gasoline. They had brought enough to supply them for 2 months, and it would take days to unload it all. Late in the day, enemy bombers were sighted overhead, but they succeeded in damaging only one destroyer in the huge force supporting the invasion. August 8th, Marines on Guadalcanal marched inland. Meeting little more than isolated sniper fire, they quickly captured the nearly completed landing strip and renamed it Henderson Field in honor of a Marine aviator who died in the Battle of Midway. On August 9th, as the Marines began to work on Henderson Field, they received distressing news. Because of serious losses during a night naval battle, amphibious and air support groups would be withdrawn immediately, leaving the Marines already on land to fend for themselves and taking all supplies that remained on board, nearly half of what the Marines had brought with them. The call went out: send us airplanes, now. It took time. The first carrier with planes destined for Guadalcanal had left Hawaii little more than a week before. As they headed southwest, they received updates on conditions in the Solomons. Somewhere inland of Henderson Field were thousands of Japanese troops hiding in the hills. In addition, the Marines were receiving daily raids from enemy bombers. The quiet on Guadalcanal had ended. August 20th, F-4F Wildcats of VMF 223 and Douglas SBD-3 Dauntlesses of VMSB 232 were launched from their carrier while still 200 miles from Guadalcanal. 2 more squadrons were on their way and would arrive 10 days later. When they landed at Henderson Field, a cheer went up all around. At last, the Marines had their own air power with which to fight. The planes were improved, too. The SBD-3s that arrived that day had just been issued to the squadron to replace their old SBD-2s. The newer model plane boasted heavy armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. They were put to use immediately. It had become clear that the Japanese intended to defeat the Marines, no matter how high the cost. They had permitted the landing, but had isolated the Marines on the island without a naval force to back them up. Now the Japanese would squeeze and squeeze until the invasion was crushed. This would not be easy at all. The Marines mounted a full-fledged offensive that combined artillery, airstrikes, and lots of hot, close-in jungle fighting in a furious effort to take every inch of this large island, half the size of the state of Connecticut. Now the improvised tactics of 1927 were put to use again. SBD Dauntlesses rose from the field, carrying bombs under their wings for short trips that would take them just past the front lines of battle. Radio contact with observers in the field allowed the attacking aircraft to find hidden positions in which the enemy lay concealed and place their bombs and machine gun fire where they would have the greatest effect. The men on the ground still had a long, arduous fight, but when they saw the wings of the Dauntless overhead, they could take heart that the end was now a little closer. As time went on, many more aircraft, Marine, Army, and Navy, arrived at Henderson Field. It became one of the most important bases in the South Pacific. Time and again, the Japanese tried to put it out of commission, and the battle on Guadalcanal itself raged for 6 months before the Allies could call the island all their own. But by that time, it was clear that Japanese expansion had been reversed. Their great gamble had failed. But they were a proud and determined people, encouraged by their leaders to fight to the last man rather than surrender. How many more lives would it cost on both sides before this horrible, greedy gamble was played to the last hand? It was now more than 2 years later. 2 long, hard years of brave battles, men fighting and dying, bombers pounding a string of tiny islands with millions of tons of explosives. The Allies had followed a successful strategy of island jumping. Like a game of hopscotch on their trek to Japan, they had taken only the bases necessary to provide a thorough network of air cover and supplies. And now, after 2 years, the guns of the fleet set their aim on the tiny island of Okinawa, only 350 miles from Japan. The coming invasion would prove the culmination of all that the Allied Pacific forces had learned during the war. This was to be the largest invasion of the Pacific War. 180,000 ground troops, with 360,000 more providing support of all kinds. More ships, more airplanes from all services and all countries than had ever before been thrown at the Japanese. Air and ground forces would be set against 85,000 enemy troops at the start of the invasion. But this force could swell to almost double that size, with reinforcements from nearby islands, local militia, and even militarized civilians. For when the Allies flew over the island of Okinawa, they did not possess the psychological advantage of liberating a recently enslaved population. The Japanese had considered Okinawa their own since the 17th century. To invade this tiny island, 1/5 the size of Guadalcanal, was like invading Japan itself. First target for Marine aviators would be airfields and local shipping. Every plane destroyed on the ground meant one less to destroy in the air. At this point in the war, the Japanese were running short of trained pilots, but young men entered training daily. Japan had no shortage of youth willing to sacrifice their lives to the cause. April 1st, the invasion began. The 1st and 6th Divisions were the first Marines off the ships. They would be followed by the 2nd and 5th. Using tactics now familiar, the Japanese did not seriously oppose the initial landings. But it would not stay that way. Kamikaze attacks began in earnest. Enemy pilots used their aircraft as flying bombs. It was suicide, desperation, pure and simple. But when they succeeded, the effect could prove devastating. One hit might sink an entire aircraft carrier. And they kept on coming day after day. April 4th. After 3 days of relatively easy going, American forces ran head-on into the Shuri Line, a series of well-sited, camouflaged defensive positions, many dug into the earth and stone. The Americans fought with tanks, artillery, flamethrowers, and used explosives to blast their adversaries out of caves and tunnels. Marines, now able to fly out of captured bases on Okinawa, provided close bombing support. They attacked defensive positions high in the hills that had held back ground troops with withering fire. Over the last 2 years, new aircraft had come online. The pride of the Marines was the F-4U Corsair. Developed for the Navy but initially considered unacceptable for carrier use, the Marines had inherited this cast-off fighter almost by default. Another hand-me-down in use was the sturdy Mitchell bomber. The Army Air Corps called it the B-25. To the Marines, it was the PBJ. The reliable SBD Dauntless was being replaced by the less successful SB-2C Helldiver. Nicknamed the Beast, it became profoundly unpopular with pilots. New weapons were also making their appearance, especially self-powered air-to-ground rockets, which could produce a devastating effect on a well-sighted enemy. The Marines on the ground gave the Corsair a nickname, the Sweetheart of Okinawa. But the Japanese had a different name for the bird that dove on them with an odd, high-pitched sound, created by rushing air in its wing-mounted oil coolers. They called it Whistling Death. As days became weeks, and later months, the Japanese launched every aircraft they could in a desperate attempt to stop the Allies. Hundreds of planes, both new and old types, took off daily, and they were met by Marine pilots in F-4U Corsairs. Much more than a tactical bomber, the Corsair was first and foremost a fighter. Its 18-cylinder engine could develop as much as 2,000 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful fighters in the sky. Clearly more than a match for even the best Japanese counterpart. Dozens of Marine aviators became aces behind the stick of the Corsair, and legends were born in tight, twisting battles that daily filled the skies around the island. The last days of the war also saw successful experiments in the evacuation of wounded men from near the front lines. It was a practice that could save a significant percentage of seriously injured GIs. Improved medevac methods such as this would be used extensively in future conflicts. The fighting continued through the month of April. Word came in May of the surrender of Germany, but still the battle went on. Finally, in June, the last strongholds fell to the Americans. A little more than 6 weeks later, the first atomic bomb fell upon Hiroshima, bringing World War II to a swift and violent conclusion. Out of these ashes, a new nation and a new world would have to be built. What that might bring for the generations that were to inherit it, only time would tell. Marine Air had come of age during World War II, and with its growth had come powerful new aircraft like this F-4U Corsair. They were long, hard years for the men who fought that war, but the development and refinement of Marine air tactics had come about in a remarkably short time. However, in the post-war years, there were many who believed that the emergence of the new and independent United States Air Force in 1947 eliminated the need for a separate Marine air arm. The struggle to preserve this new and effective addition to the Marine arsenal would continue behind the scenes in a new conflict on the cold and barren peninsula of Korea. Only 5 years after the close of World War II, bullets were flying again. This time the guns were being fired by Chinese and North Korean soldiers, and they were firing at United States Marines who were acting as part of a United Nations police force. But police action seemed a strange and ironic name for what was going on here. It looked like a war and smelled like a war, and many people were quite likely to call it a war, leaving finer distinctions to politicians. November 27, 1950. 10th Corps 1st Marine Division, which had been advancing rapidly northward near the Chosin reservoir, had suddenly run into stiff resistance. Working with them were Navy and Marine F-4U Corsairs and AD Sky Raiders from Task Force 77 off the coast of North Korea in the Sea of Japan. Using the now traditional tactics of Marine close air support, Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 312 joined with land-based squadrons in strafing and bombing missions to keep enemy forces at bay during the daylight hours. Forward air controllers, who were actually Marine pilots on the ground, used radio communication to pinpoint the exact location of sniper sites. But more enemy troops seemed to be showing up daily. By November 28th, it was clear that the Marines would have to reassess the situation. Marine troops landing at Hungnam Harbor had penetrated deep into the interior of communist North Korea in their latest offensive. To the west, the 8th Army, proceeding from MacArthur's famous Incheon landing, had done the same thing. But on November 1st, China had aggressively entered the war, saving the North Korean communists from being pushed off the map. With the aid of new intelligence and field reports, the Americans now discovered that thousands of Chinese troops, moving at night, had surrounded the 14,000 men of 10th Corps at Chosin Reservoir. The Chinese now controlled the roads and valleys behind the Marines as well. 10th Corps was surrounded and thoroughly cut off from their lines of supply. Faced with an army that now significantly outnumbered them, their only hope was to fight their way back to Hungnam, where, if necessary, they could be evacuated by sea. December 1st. The Marines pulled out, heading back the way they came in. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Retreat hell, they growled. We're just attacking in another direction. And that was true enough. Their very survival now depended on the ability of these 14,000 men to fight their way out in a long, vulnerable column, down a narrow and predictable path to the sea. Snipers and artillery fired at them from the hills. Roadblocks slowed their progress. Sometimes they had to take the hills on either side of the road, then pack up Chinese prisoners to take along with them. And on they went. Air Force C-119 flying boxcars provided supplies along the way, and Marine aviators provided the invaluable air support. Earlier in the war, Marine Air had been placed under the jurisdiction of MacArthur's Far East Air Force. This meant that for the first time, Marines had to submit their daily requests for air support to headquarters in Japan, as much as 16 hours before they were to be carried out. This was acceptable procedure for strategic bombing, but Marine commanders considered it an obstruction to good tactical practice as they had developed it. Technically, the Air Force generals could also give higher priority to Army operations to the west that were not usually part of the Marine Corps job. A more sinister rumor suggested that this could be an Air Force plan to prove to Congress that Marine Air was merely an unnecessary duplication of service, requiring Air Force control to work efficiently, and might therefore be financially expendable. If this was the plan, and it doesn't seem to have been, it never reached its goal. After some struggle, the Marines managed to keep their priorities and the local control of their own units, although on paper, they remained under the Far East Air Force Command. As a result, they were able to mount an impressive campaign to help 10th Corps fight their way back to Hungnam. This kept them almost constantly in the air from late November through the first 2 weeks of December. Reliable F-4U Corsairs were the backbone of this operation. Rockets, bombs, or napalm were the preferred ordnance for ground attack, since the Corsairs' 20mm cannon tended to freeze up in the cold. They ranged up and down the column of 10th Corps all day long. Our 5D transports were rigged as tactical air direction centers to coordinate operations from the best possible vantage point. Completing the picture were small spotter planes that could act as forward air controllers for individual strikes when a controller on the ground was not practical. At any one time, an average of 24 aircraft could be seen in the sky, orbiting over the Marine column as they moved south. The ambush busters, as they were called, made all the difference. The breakout succeeded. December 10th. The 1st Marines of 10th Corps reached Hang Nam. Now, behind a protective screen that included heavy artillery and naval gunfire, they prepared for evacuation by sea. After dynamiting the harbor at Hang Nam, the troops would return to hold the line in Korea near the 38th parallel, right where the war had started. Ultimately, communist aggression had failed to significantly alter the political map of Korea. No ground had been gained or lost. Yet it had proven a fruitful time for marine aviation. Even under harsh weather conditions, the doctrine of close air support had once again proven itself invaluable in combat. The Korean conflict also saw the introduction of the first Marine jets, the first promising use of helicopters in a variety of roles, and the use of F-7F Tigercat night fighters equipped with radar. Marine Air emerged from the Korean War as a respected, battle-proven, and innovative force. A force to be reckoned with. The old questions would never be asked again. December 1967. Location: the hills surrounding Khe Sanh, a sparsely populated plateau in the extreme northwest corner of South Vietnam. The Marines had been here since 1966. After a year of quiet, some hill battles had flared briefly in the spring, but now it looked like a bigger conflict was brewing. Intelligence sources suggested that at least 2 full NVA divisions had crossed the nearby demilitarized zone and Laotian border, and were digging in somewhere in these hills for what must be a major offensive, probably tied to the Vietnamese New Year, which would come at the end of January. Accordingly, the Marines have been building up their defenses, resurfacing the dirt airstrip at Khe Sanh Combat Base, adding new troop strength and stockpiling arms and supplies for the anticipated battle. Khe Sanh had become a veritable fortress in the countryside. General William Westmoreland, head of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, felt that Khe Sanh might be a first step in a North Vietnamese bid to take permanent possession of South Vietnam's northern province.
Khe Sanh was an important outpost. If the enemy had taken this outpost, I think the province of Quang Tri and the DMZ area would have been in jeopardy. The enemy had planned to take it as part of his Tet Offensive. At the same time, he had planned to overrun Quang Tri City, seize and hold Wake, and to roll up our defenses south of the demilitarized zone.
And so still more troops began to arrive. By mid-January 1968, the stage had been set. Inside the perimeter of the half-square-mile combat base were nearly 6,000 Marines, a battalion of South Vietnamese Rangers, and a handful of Air Force and CB support troops. More Marines were dug into the hilltops of 4 important hills nearby, giving the Americans control of the nearest high ground. But somewhere beyond the sandbags and concertina wire was the largest force mustered by the enemy to date. 20,000 North Vietnamese Army troops. January 21st. An intense barrage of mortar rounds hit the base. Early in the day, a shell exploded directly over the main ammunition dump. The dump erupted, sending thousands of burning artillery shells and mortar rounds into the air. It was 48 hours before it could be cleared of live ammunition. As the Marines fought back, a cache of tear gas was also hit. January 22nd. Upon receiving word of the attack, Operation Niagara got rapidly underway. This was a joint operation of air support for Khe Sanh that would last for 77 days. Marine aviators formed the backbone of close air support. But before it was over, there was plenty of thanks to be handed around. General Westmoreland gave the support of Khe Sanh priority over all other operations in Vietnam, handing the Marines virtually anything they asked for. They asked for a lot. Both air support and artillery were supervised by the FSCC, or Fire Support Coordination Center at Khe Sanh, so the control was kept locally. Much as in Korea, an airborne command and control center and airborne forward air controllers kept things running smoothly and accurately. Day after day, Marine F-4s, A-4s, A-6s, and F-8s pounded enemy positions with ordnance, hour after hour. They were joined at times by Army, Air Force, and Navy flyers, and by Vietnamese pilots flying Korean War vintage A-1 Sky Raiders, a slow-flying attack aircraft that could carry a heavy ordnance load. Under this constant barrage, the enemy's abortive early attempts to penetrate the perimeter of the base ceased. A prolonged period of continuous daily shelling began. But Khe Sanh was not just a battle of shells, bombs, machine guns, and rockets. The single land route to the base had been cut, and all food and supplies had to be brought by air. January 30th. The nationwide Tet Offensive began. Communist forces rose from concealment and waged a fierce, headline-grabbing battle at locations all around the country. At Khe Sanh, it was oddly quiet. A modest lull, though sporadic fighting continued. It was only temporary. The worst was yet to come. February 10th. A Marine C-130 carrying bladders filled with fuel erupted in flames when it was hit by a barrage of enemy fire on landing. From now on, C-130s would use an ingenious method of deplaning their cargo that kept them near the ground for the shortest amount of time possible. When rain, fog, or heavy overcast precluded safe landing, the supplies came anyway. The Marines boasted, "We're knee-deep in bullets, beans, and bandages." Morale was not a problem here. Reconnaissance patrols went out almost daily in a constant attempt to verify enemy positions and movement. In some cases, the fighting was eyeball to eyeball, and there were casualties. Throughout the Vietnam War, medical evacuation had become the specialty of the helicopter. CH-53 and CH-46 crews braved uncertain weather and enemy fire to get seriously wounded soldiers to timely medical attention. The weather was a significant ally to the North Vietnamese. It was no accident that they had chosen the monsoon season to make their attack. They used the low overcast as a shield. The cloud layer frequently stayed a few hundred feet above the runway. The heaviest artillery barrages were launched when the clouds, which shrouded the hillsides, kept enemy firing positions from view. At times like this, their own forward ground observers could descend just below the clouds and direct fire quite accurately, while remaining well camouflaged in the densely forested lower slopes. The North Vietnamese force was so large and spread out that Air Force B-52s could be called in. The arc light strikes that they provided both day and night were devastating and had a significant effect on the enemy. In the press, it was called the Siege of Khe Sanh. That was a picture that the Marines felt inappropriate. Webster's defined siege as the act or process of surrounding and attacking a fortified place in such a way as to isolate it from help and supplies, thereby making capture possible. The NVA had done this to the French many years before Dien Bien Phu, but they did not do it here. Once the dimension of air power had been added, it was no longer sufficient merely to surround your adversary on the ground. Wars were fought in 3 dimensions now, and the Marines at Khe Sanh were never for a moment isolated from help and supplies. In the end, the North Vietnamese simply gave up and left. No ground had been taken. Their Tet Offensive had failed long ago. They would have to find another way to stop the United States Armed Forces. Khe Sanh added another successful chapter to the book of Marine Corps history. One sergeant remembered that at the height of battle, as jets screamed overhead and artillery fired almost non-stop, he found a 19-year-old gunner blithely singing a familiar tune at the top of his lungs. If the Army and the Navy ever gaze on heaven's scenes, he sang, they will find the streets are guarded by United States Marines.
No longer in question is the need for Marine Air. They have forged a valuable and effective team of pilots and crewmen who will be called upon again and again, as they have so often in the past, to support their comrades on the ground. Aircraft with highly specialized and formidable capabilities have joined the fleet. Helicopters for attack and transport, and jets that can take off and land vertically provide a flexibility undreamed of only 20 years ago. On land, on sea, and in the air, the Marines are ready as a team to go and fight whenever and wherever their country needs them.